Okay, artists, let's talk about inking and the logic behind it. So remember, you want to have a healthy amount of line weight, specifically different line weights. You're thin, you're slightly thicker, thicker still, thickest. You can jump between the numbers like 0.005, 0.3, or you're small, you're fine, you're medium, your brush. You're going to want to start first with really light line art. And if you can only just make this out, it's a little food fight, a teeming picture where I've got an angry sandwich, egg, etc. Now, you'll want to like fish scale your characters like this so that they're overlapping one over the other, kind of like so, as opposed to just floating around one another with all this empty space. A teeming picture should have overlap. So let's take a look. Here you can see some cookies. And the logic is we're using atmospheric perspective and the rules of visual hierarchy to ink this. Notice that it's thinnest lines in back as the objects are getting further away from us and harder to see. And as we move forward, those lines get a little thicker to the thickest in the foreground, but yet details still stay pretty darn small. Maybe thicker than this because they're so much closer to us and now visible, but still thinner in comparison to, say, silhouettes, the chunks of the chips, the larger elements of this piece, essentially the things that would get emphasis in the cookie. They get emphasized lines, and de-emphasized things like the subtlety of texture or small crumbs, those might remain thin, okay? So to actually put this in practice, I went over this little garden scene with a thin 0.005. And I would encourage you to do this too, just a pass with the thinnest value, the thinnest nib that you've got, because now we know that our smallest details will stay that way, but certain elements need a little extra oomph, a little extra emphasis, so we can go back over it for a second or a third or a fourth pass with our thicker markers. Now, I've got a 0.05. Let's bump once more up. So the pink flamingo, the shrubbery, that is furthest in the background, probably okay to stay thinner. But my gnome looks like it's on the same plane as that background if it's the same line weight. So it might make sense to thicken him up a bit to bring him forward, to add a little more emphasis and show that he's nearer us, right? So I'm getting a little more generosity with my width. Now, when I ink, something to bear in mind is you do want to keep it clean if you can. Instinctually, you'll probably want to aim for precision. But a lot of people make a very crucial mistake. They think that precision means working very, very slowly. And when they do that, notice your lines get a little janky because as you're pulling it across, friction is increasing, your heartbeat is still pounding in your chest. You'll get these slight little tremors, as opposed to putting a point down and pulling across and getting a much smoother line. It's not that you need to rush it or that you just have to, you just need to avoid working so incredibly slowly. The truth is you just need to keep it moving and confidently. So if I press, go, press, go, curve, curve, curve. And before I make a tricky line, I might just hover my fingers, my nib above the paper and test it a couple times to ensure that I've kind of practiced And of course, there's always scrap paper too. So let's go back to our gnome here. I'm adding a little extra line weight because he's near me. But then remember, we're considering atmospheric perspective, which we've considered in the background here. We're considering visual hierarchy, so what small details might stay small, like texture in the hat, maybe suggestions, the curls in his beard. Those can be small and stay small. But now I also want to consider the light. And the lighting means if I've got a light source casting in one direction, there's going to be slightly thicker lines the side furthest from that light source. And that's a good rule, but I think people tend to overuse it. In truth, I don't really give that much consideration when I'm inking. What I do consider, the small little areas I might want to add a little zhuzh of a shadow to. Not a lot. Like, you don't want to do this, where you start flooding large swaths of black onto your paper. I mean, you can, if that's what you want to go for in the end, but you can go a little too far too quickly. Instead, I'm just going to consider a light source from above and then say, consider where natural canopies are. A little cast shadow under the nose, for example. Underneath the eyebrows. To suggest the canopy of the mustache right underneath here. Maybe a little cast by the beard. I don't need to go overboard, but it goes a long way in giving a little sense of dimension to our character. A little shadow cast by the drapery of his pants. Maybe his belt. The sort of like little roll of stomach cast over his belt. Throws a shadow there. Right? And now I would do the same with my little snail. Only this time I could even go in and just add a little more thickness to push him further into the foreground as well. Not much. And at this second pass, I can also take the opportunity to try to clean up lines that looked a little janky in the first pass. Where were they inconsistent? Where were they a little chunky? Can I make them smoother? And again, not wanting to overdo the black, but just find some areas that could naturally use a little cast shadow. A little extra darkness does wonders. And in fact, remember, the more line variation you have, the more visually appealing it's going to be, the more interesting it is for a viewer. Our eyes are naturally attracted to contrast. Right? That's why if you had 3 spherical balls in a row and then 1 black orb on the right, our eyes are going to dart to that because it's different from the others. It's unique. It's more interesting, hence the contrast. So now I'm going to ask myself, where would additional shadow likely be? Let's add a little depth to this spiral. There you go. Ooh, little shadow cast in the upper reaches of the mouth here, very far back. Maybe a little canopy shadow right under the shell there, which would make sense. You fill in the lower half of those pupils, make it interesting. And remember, the silhouettes of characters or creatures oftentimes get a little extra oomph, a final pass perhaps, with like a brush or something. Just the silhouettes, for the same reason Bugs Bunny has a thicker silhouette around his body than, say, the line work that creates the features of his face or the details of his fur. It's because it helps to separate your character from the background, which is helpful for the audience. And again, takes atmospheric perspective into consideration and brings your character forward, kind of into the spotlight, if you will. So now you can see our little snail does have variations in thin and thick lines. Some de-emphasized but vital details like the parting of the teeth, the little notches in his shell. They're de-emphasized details, so they get de-emphasized or lighter line weight, right? Whereas larger details are more prominent, like facial features get a little more thickness, like a little greater line weight to bring him forward, opposite the things behind him. And then, of course, the artful occasional little shadow here and there to help add that contrast, make it visually appealing. Okay? So this is what you want to consider with your own teaming pictures. Take the 3 rules and put them together. Feel free to avoid like overdoing like the consideration of light, the light source, but do consider just the occasional little extra thickness of cast shadow when you ink, and make certain you're getting that variation, the thin, the thick, to make it visually appealing. Let's give it another go. See what you can do and ask questions if you've got them. I look forward to seeing what you create, and compare this to the start. Compare your later work to your earlier. Take a picture of the before and after and just see how much that line weight variation can bring to your piece and just how professional it can make a sketch. Thanks. You got this.